The silence of the Oak Creek estate was shattered by the sharp, crystalline explosion of a blue porcelain vase hitting the parquet floor. Marlene stood frozen, her breath hitching as she stared at the jagged shards glinting like teeth in the afternoon sun. She didn't reach for a broom. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tapped the banking app, only to find a cold, gray screen. Access denied. Panic surged as she realized her wallet was a leather husk, stripped of every cent, and the high-tech locks on the front door had just engaged with a heavy, final thud. A low, familiar engine purred in the driveway 3 hours ahead of schedule. Marlene scrambled toward the attic, her knees scraping the floorboards, desperate for anything to sell or trade. But her hand struck a hidden oak chest she had never seen before. As the front door creaked open downstairs, she pried the lid back, expecting gold but finding only bundles of letters written in a frantic, desperate hand. The first line she read turned her blood to ice. "If you are reading this, he has already started to make you forget." Footsteps began a slow, rhythmic ascent up the stairs, and Marlene realized the house wasn't a home. It was a trap that had been set long before she ever arrived. Marlene Baxter knelt on the plush cream carpet of the Oak Creek estate, her fingers moving with the precision of a diamond cutter. Each fiber of the rug had to align, a sea of wool directed by an invisible ruler. She shifted her weight, the silk of her dress whispering against her skin, and moved toward the grand chandelier. The scent of lemon wax and sterile cleanliness hung heavy in the air, a scent that meant safety as long as it remained undisturbed. She polished the crystal pendants with a rag, soaked in a harsh spirit solution, until her fingertips burned and turned a raw, angry pink. Every glass drop had to catch the afternoon sun without a single smudge. For Thomas checked the tension of the drapes and the clarity of the glass with the pads of his fingers, searching for a reason to find her wanting. She moved to the bookshelves, wiping microscopic dust from the leather spines, arranging them by height until they formed a jagged, perfect skyline. Her breath came in shallow, controlled sips. She scanned the room, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's, hunting for the tiniest flaw that might invite Thomas's cold, dissecting gaze. She reached toward the highest shelf of the mahogany cabinet, her arm extending to nudge a porcelain figurine back into its designated coordinates. The lace of her sleeve, a delicate thing Thomas had chosen specifically for this afternoon, snagged on the sharp, hand-carved edge of the pedestal. Time seemed to liquefy. The thin Chinese vase, a relic of a dynasty long dead, rocked on its base. It hung in the air for a heartbeat, a splash of blue and white against the beige wallpaper, before it plummeted. The crash echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Shards of ceramic erupted across the dark parquet, glinting in the sunlight like jagged ice. Marlene froze, her hand still reaching for empty air. The silence that followed was deafening, a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Below her, amidst the wreckage of the antique, a deep, jagged gouge marred the polished wood of the floor, a permanent scar in Thomas's temple of perfection. Panic, cold and oily, surged up her throat. Marlene lunged for her leather handbag, her fingers fumbling with the brass clasp. She tore the wallet open, her nails scraping against the empty silk lining. She found only a few copper pennies and a stray button. With a trembling hand, she snatched her phone from the marble countertop and tapped the banking app. The screen flickered, then displayed a mocking system error. Access denied. Thomas had been busy this morning. He hadn't just changed the Wi-Fi password. He had severed her umbilical cord to the world, wiping her access to the joint accounts and freezing the secondary cards he once let her carry like a leash. She turned the bag inside out, shaking it with a desperate, frantic energy, hoping for a forgotten $20 bill or even a $5. Nothing fell out but lint. The emptiness of the wallet mirrored the chilling void in her chest. She was a prisoner in a house of gold, and the warden had just cut off the rations. She dropped to her knees, the sharp edges of the porcelain biting into her skin. She clutched a tube of industrial adhesive, her knuckles white. With a shaking hand, she tried to marry two jagged edges of the vase, but the sticky resin smeared across the blue glaze, leaving cloudy, amateurish streaks. The more she pressed, the more the fracture gaped, a white toothy grin mocking her efforts. A thin, jagged line remained visible, a silver scar that no amount of glue could heal. Thomas noticed everything, a single stray hair on the rug, a smudge on a wine glass, and this botched repair would be a beacon for his fury. Sweat beaded on her temples, stinging her eyes. Her fingers stuck to the cold shards, the glue bonding her to the evidence of her failure. She realized with a sickening jolt that this attempt to hide the truth would only sharpen the edge of his eventual rage. The attic door groaned, a long, rusted protest that vibrated through the soles of her feet. Marlene pushed against the heavy oak, stepping into a world of stagnant air and forgotten history. The smell hit her immediately, a thick cocktail of dust, decaying paper, and the musty scent of old wool. She navigated the narrow paths between towers of cardboard boxes and furniture draped in ghostly white sheets, her movements cat-like and silent. The flashlight in her hand cut a narrow, trembling path through the gloom, illuminating thick cobwebs that hung from the rafters like tattered lace. She was hunting for the small, chintz-covered box her mother had tucked away years ago behind the old dresser. By the time she reached the far wall, her knees were coated in a fine gray silt, her breath hitching as she shoved aside stacks of yellowed newspapers and the skeletal remains of broken chairs. She heaved aside a pile of moth-eaten blankets, the fabric disintegrating under her touch. In the deepest shadow of the eaves, where the roof sloped down to meet the floor, her hand struck something hard and cold. It was a massive chest, crafted from oak so dark it looked charred. The brass corners had turned a sickly, crusty green with age, and the lid bore a set of initials she didn't recognize. E.H. Marlene ran her palm over the freezing metal, a shiver racing up her spine. This wasn't her mother's. This didn't belong in the Wilson family history. Thomas must have hauled this here during the move, a piece of baggage he had never mentioned. The chest felt heavy, not just with weight, but with a palpable, dark significance. It sat in the dust like a tombstone, guarding secrets that had no place in the light of the floors below. She jammed the tip of a pair of old sewing scissors into the rusted lock, twisting with a desperate, frantic strength. The mechanism gave way with a sharp, metallic crack that seemed to echo through the entire house. Marlene pried the lid open. Inside, she found neat bundles of letters, bound tightly with yellowing twine. She pulled the top envelope from the stack, her heart hammering against her ribs. The name, Thomas Baxter, was written in a beautiful, flowing calligraphy she had never seen before. The return address belonged to a woman Thomas had always described as a tragic memory, his first wife, Elizabeth. Marlene tore the envelope open, the dry paper whispering and crinkling in her shaking hands. Her eyes raced over the lines, absorbing words of raw despair and whispered pleas for a mercy that clearly never came. The cold draft of the attic seemed to turn to ice, soaking into her bones. Her breath hitched, sticking in her throat as the uberous handwriting revealed a nightmare. Elizabeth's words were a mirror. The woman described a life where leaving the house required a written petition, where every cent was accounted for and every friend was a spy. Marlene saw her own life reflected in the complaints of constant surveillance and the systematic deprivation of resources. Elizabeth wrote of how Thomas would laugh at her memory, telling her she had forgotten conversations that never happened. making her doubt the very ground she stood on. Marlene gripped the paper so hard it tore at the edges. Each sentence was a scream from the past, an echo of the silent cries Marlene had stifled in the empty, perfect rooms downstairs. She wasn't unique. She was a sequel. At the very bottom of the chest, beneath the letters, lay a leather-bound notebook. The handwriting inside was different, cold, precise, and unmistakably Thomas's. Marlene flipped the pages, her skin crawling. It wasn't a diary. It was a manual. Thomas had recorded step-by-step instructions on how to gaslight Elizabeth. He noted the exact dosages of medications he had swapped, the dates he had moved her keys or rearranged the furniture to trigger her confusion. He had kept charts of her emotional collapses, documenting her descents into sobbing self-doubt with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a lab rat. Marlene's fingers turned to ice. He had planned the breakdowns. He had engineered the madness. The mathematical precision of his cruelty was more terrifying than any physical blow. She dropped the notebook, the leather thudding softly on the dusty floor. The final entry glared up at her, a brief note about the final liberation from the burden. The realization hit her like a physical strike to the stomach. Elizabeth hadn't run away. She hadn't found a new life. Thomas had erased her. He had dismantled her will until she was nothing but a hollow shell, a project he had finished and filed away. Every loving correction Thomas had ever given Marlene, every time he had gently suggested she was tired or forgetful, flashed through her mind like a series of strobe lights. He didn't love her. He was just running the experiment again, refining his technique on a new subject. She was currently on page 40 of a book that ended in a grave. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the attic walls, the sound of a high-end engine purring to a halt in the driveway. Marlene jumped, the sound of Thomas's brakes screeching in her ears like a predatory bird. He was 3 hours early. The rigid schedule that usually gave her room to breathe had been discarded. The heavy thud of a car door closing echoed through the house, followed by the sharp, metallic turn of a key in the front lock. Thomas's footsteps, measured and heavy, resonated in the hall below. Marlene froze in the attic dust, clutching the letters and the notebook to her chest as if they could shield her. Her heart thundered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm that she feared he could hear even from the foyer. She frantically shoved the letters and the notebook beneath the stiff lace of her corset, the cold, sharp edges of the paper biting into her skin. She lowered the lid of the oak chest, moving with the agonizing slowness of a shadow to avoid a single creak. Thomas's footsteps were on the stairs now, heading toward the upper landing. Marlene retreated into the deepest darkness behind a moth-eaten wardrobe, her pupils blowing wide with a primal, suffocating terror. Every smile he had ever given her now looked like a serrated edge. She knew now that the next blank page in that notebook was reserved for her obituary. She held her breath, her lungs burning, as Thomas's shadow stretched across the attic door. The hinges of the attic door shrieked, a short, dry sound that felt like a needle across Marlene's nerves. Thomas's silhouette filled the frame, a tall, dark void against the bright, artificial light of the hallway. Marlene stood paralyzed, the letters beneath her dress feeling like shards of glass. Thomas didn't speak. He clicked on a heavy industrial flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel. He swept the light across the dust-covered floor, lingering on Marlene's disheveled hair and the gray streaks of soot on her pale silk hem. His eyes were chips of blue ice, heavy and leaden with a sudden, sharp suspicion. She watched the wings of his nose flare as he inhaled the scent of the disturbed attic air. He took a single step forward, and the floorboards groaned under his weight, a warning that went unheeded. Marlene tried to bolt, her body angling to slip through the narrow gap between Thomas and the doorframe. Before she could move an inch, his fingers clamped around her wrist. It wasn't a touch. It was a steel trap. Her skin went white under the pressure, then a dull, angry purple as the blood was cut off. Thomas tilted his head, the scent of peppermint and expensive tobacco washing over her face in a sickening wave. When he spoke, his voice was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle her very bones. He demanded to know why she was lurking in the dark, why she was breathing in the filth of the past. Marlene felt a numbing cold spread from her hand to her elbow as he shook her once, a sharp, jarring motion that demanded an answer she couldn't give. Thomas's gaze shifted, the flashlight beam landing on the oak chest. The fresh, bright scratch on the tarnished brass lock gleamed like a confession. He released her arm so abruptly she stumbled, nearly hitting the floor. He approached the chest, his long fingers trailing over the jagged metal where she had forced the lock. His face smoothed out, transforming into a terrifying, waxen mask of calm. Marlene watched his jaw muscles ripple, a slow, rhythmic grinding. He turned his head slowly, his eyes moving from the open lid to Marlene's hands, which she had instinctively pressed against her stomach to hide the bulge of the letters. The only sounds in the attic were Thomas's whistling breath and the faint, ghostly rustle of old plaster crumbling behind the walls. He knew. The secrets of the dead woman were no longer his alone. As the Wisconsin twilight bled into a bruised purple, Thomas opened a sleek, black case on the kitchen island. Marlene watched from the shadows of the hallway as he began to install small plastic hemispheres into the crown molding. The power drill screamed, a high-pitched mechanical whine as it bit into the white plaster, dusting Thomas's broad shoulders with a fine, chalky powder. One by one, tiny, crimson eyes flickered to life in the corners of the kitchen, the living room, and the foyer. To Marlene, those red dots looked like cigarette burns on the fabric of her reality. Thomas adjusted the lenses, his thumb flicking across a tablet screen as he focused the feed on her favorite armchair. The house had become a glass jar, and she was the insect pinned to the cork, every twitch of her eyelid recorded and filed away in his locked study. She waited until he went to the garage, then lunged for the kitchen phone, hiding it beneath a checkered dish towel. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, ready to dial 911. A shadow fell over her. Thomas was there, a silent, looming presence. He wrenched the phone from her hand with such violence that her fingernails snapped, sending a jolt of pain up her arm. He didn't yell. He simply raised the phone and brought it down against the granite countertop with a sickening crunch. The sound of shattering glass and splintering plastic filled the room. Thomas ground the remains under the heel of his Italian leather shoe, turning the screen into a pile of sparkling black sand. Marlene pressed her bleeding finger to her lips, her eyes wide. He spoke then, his voice melodic and calm, explaining that her episodes were becoming dangerous and that technology was only feeding her tragic, mounting paranoia. Thomas placed a heavy, faceted glass on the table in front of her. The water inside wasn't clear. It had a dull, milky quality, with faint, iridescent slicks shimmering on the surface. A sharp, medicinal odor wafted from the rim, something chemical and cold. Marlene shook her head, but Thomas's hand moved with lightning speed, cupping the back of her skull. His palm felt like a hot iron. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look into the depths of the glass. The cold rim pressed against her lower teeth, clinking rhythmically as she trembled. He tipped the glass, and the bitter, viscous liquid flooded her mouth. She gagged, the fluid burning her throat as he forced her to swallow, his grip never wavering until the glass was empty. He wiped a stray drop from her chin with a linen napkin, his eyes bright with a terrifying, quiet triumph. Marlene's eyes snapped open, but the world had lost its edges. The walls of the bedroom seemed to liquefy, swaying in a slow, sickening rhythm. Through the thick, gray fog of the sedative, she saw Thomas moving like a ghost. He was silent as he shoved the heavy mahogany dresser toward the window, the wood screaming against the parquet. He dragged the full-length mirror across the floor, repositioning it by the door. The sounds reached her as if from underwater. In her mind, the shadows stretched into distorted faces, a parade of monsters born from the chemicals in her blood. Thomas was rebuilding the room, changing the geography of her life while she watched, helpless. She tried to scream, but her tongue was a heavy, useless slab of meat in her mouth. She knew that in the morning, he would tell her the furniture had always been there, and her own mind would be the only witness against her. She waited until the house went silent, then dragged herself toward the front door, her muscles feeling like lead. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled. Instead of the familiar click of the latch, a sharp, electronic beep echoed through the foyer. A new keypad glowed on the wall, its blue digits mocking her. She threw her weight against the oak door, but it was as solid as a tomb wall. She scrambled to the living room window, fumbling with the sash, but the wood wouldn't budge. Thomas had installed hidden steel pins in the frames. He stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the hall light, watching her frantic, weak movements with the detached interest of a man watching a clock. Marlene beat her palms against the reinforced glass, leaving pale, sweaty smears. The estate was no longer a home, it was a pressurized chamber, and Thomas held the only valve. A flash of movement caught her eye. The neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was out by the hedge, his shears clicking rhythmically. Marlene pressed her face to the glass, her mouth opening in a silent, jagged scream as she hammered on the pane with her fists. Thomas was there in an instant. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders in a gesture that looked, to anyone outside, like a tender, comforting embrace. He pulled her against his chest, pinning her shaking hands between their bodies. He caught the neighbor's eye and gave a slow, mournful shake of his head, tapping his temple with one finger before gesturing to Marlene. Henderson nodded solemnly, a look of profound pity on his face, and turned back to his gardening. Marlene watched her last hope vanish behind the green leaves of the privet as Thomas whispered into her ear, his breath cold as a cellar, promising that the doctors would be here soon to help her rest. The foyer was suddenly filled with the scent of old leather and antiseptic. Dr. Miller stood there, clutching a worn black bag, his expression one of bored professional concern. Thomas shook the man's hand, their voices low and conspiratorial, a bridge of masculine understanding built over Marlene's head. She tried to speak, to tell the doctor about the oak chest, the cameras, and the locked doors, but her voice came out as a thin, pathetic wheeze. Miller didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on his clipboard, scribbling notes as Thomas described her deteriorating condition. Marlene felt the cold bite of the stethoscope against her skin, a hollow ritual. The doctor merely nodded to Thomas, confirming the diagnosis of early-onset dementia. When Thomas took the pink slip of paper, the commitment order, Marlene saw the red ink of the state seal. It looked like a bloodstain. While Thomas walked the doctor to the door, Marlene slipped into the kitchen. Her movements were jerky, uncoordinated. She yanked open the spice cabinet, her fingers knocking over jars of cumin and sage. Tucked behind the cinnamon, she found a clear plastic bag filled with unlabeled ampules. The liquid inside was thick and colorless. On the counter lay an open box of a potent antipsychotic, a drug whose side effects included the total suppression of the will. Next to it, Thomas's notebook sat open, the day's date marked with a heavy, black X. He wasn't just sedating her. He was preparing to lobotomize her personality before the ambulance arrived. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as the front door clicked shut. Thomas was coming back. Marlene slid down the cold tile wall in the corner of the kitchen, her fingers tightening around a jagged shard of her broken phone. Above her, the camera lens whirred, a tiny mechanical eye tracking her every shudder. Thomas entered the room, his movements graceful and slow. He held a sterile syringe in one hand and an alcohol swab in the other. He began to talk, his voice a soothing, terrifying caress, describing how peaceful the clinic would be, how the soft rooms would keep her from hurting herself. Marlene looked up and saw herself reflected in his pupils, a small, broken thing. Thomas took a step toward her, blotting out the light from the hallway, and she realized with a jolt of pure, icy clarity that in 1 hour, the woman named Marlene Baxter would cease to exist. Thomas's hands were like iron as he gripped her upper arms, hoisting her off the kitchen floor. He didn't carry her. He steered her, her toes dragging across the hardwood as he shoved her into the bedroom. She stumbled, her hip catching the sharp corner of the dresser with a dull thud. But he didn't let her fall. He threw a heavy bundle of blue silk onto the bed. The fabric hit the duvet with a muffled whoomp, unfolding like the wings of a predatory moth. Thomas loomed over her, his shadow stretching up the wall and across the ceiling until it seemed to swallow the entire room. He barked a command, his voice low and serrated, telling her to dress for the Labor Day banquet. He pointed to the rows of pearl buttons on the bodice. Marlene felt the cold radiating from the silk. It wasn't a dress, it was a shroud he had tailored for her final appearance. She shoved her palms against his chest, a weak, desperate attempt to create space. But Thomas's fingers clamped onto her jaw. The pressure was immense, his thumb and forefinger grinding into the bone until her mouth was forced open. The sharp, herbal stench of the medication filled her nose. He tilted her head back until she was staring at the ceiling fan and poured the oily liquid from a small glass vial directly down her throat. Marlene choked, the bitter heat of the drug searing her esophagus as she was forced to swallow. He held her jaw tight, his eyes locked on hers, until the last drop was gone. The world began to fray at the edges, the corners of the room dissolving into a shimmering, unstable haze. Thomas spun her around, and she felt the hard pressure of his knee against the small of her back. He grabbed the silk laces of the corset and pulled with a sudden, violent jerk. The internal stays crushed her ribs, leaping to squeeze the air from her lungs. Marlene let out a strangled, wet sound, but Thomas only tightened the knot. The silk stretched across her chest until the seams groaned. She opened her mouth to scream, to gasp, to do anything but suffocate. But the corset turned every attempt at a breath into a shallow, agonizing twitch. Her face flushed a deep, bruised purple as the room began to spin in earnest. She was being bound into the image of his perfect wife, one stitch at a time. As the sedative began to cloud her mind, turning her limbs to lead, Marlene let her hand drift toward the edge of the mattress. She moved with the agonizing slowness of a dream, hoping the rustle of silk would mask her movements. Her fingers found the rough, yellowed paper of the letters she had hidden earlier in the gap between the bed frame and the wall. She slid the envelopes out and, fighting the crushing weight of the drug, shoved them deep into the hidden pocket of her voluminous skirt. The sound of the paper was lost in the sudden roar of a rainstorm against the window. She pressed her hand against her thigh, the sharp edges of Elizabeth's despair biting into her skin. It was the only thing that felt real in a world that was turning to smoke. Thomas sat her down at the vanity and snapped open a heavy silver compact. He used a wide brush to buff a thick layer of flesh-colored grease onto her skin. working with the methodical focus of a mortician. He painted over the yellowing bruises on her wrists and the red marks on her neck until she looked like a creature made of porcelain. Marlene watched her own reflection as her face disappeared behind the mask, her eyes becoming distant and glassy. He finished by painting her lips a vivid, aggressive scarlet, a slash of color that looked like a fresh wound. The cloying scent of the powder mixed with the metallic tang of the medicine, making her stomach churn. Thomas nodded at his handiwork, satisfied that he had successfully buried the evidence of his care. He hooked his arm around her waist, practically dragging her toward the grand staircase. At the top landing, he leaned in, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered a final warning about the guests. Marlene looked down and saw the foyer filling with the town's elite. Sheriff Roberts in his pressed uniform, Pastor Hill adjusting his white collar. The glare of the chandeliers was a physical blow, turning the hall into a blinding, white arena. Thomas pinched the back of her arm, a sharp, hidden signal, and she forced her lips into a wide, grotesque smile. She felt her facial muscles twitching under the weight of the makeup. Below, the sheriff waved a greeting, oblivious to the fact that Thomas was the only thing keeping her upright. During the cocktail hour, Marlene gripped the polished mahogany banister with a white-knuckled intensity. The sedative had hit its stride, and the voices of the local socialites had morphed into the rhythmic, mindless buzzing of a hive. The floor beneath her feet felt like the deck of a ship in a gale, pitching and rolling. She watched the bubbles in a champagne flute erupt into tiny, stinging sparks that seemed to burn her retinas. The walls of the living room began a slow, nauseating rotation, shrinking the world until there was nothing left but the heat of the bodies around her. She tried to focus on a crystal vase on the mantel, but it fractured into 3 blurred images that danced just out of reach. Sheriff Roberts detached himself from a group of businessmen and headed toward her, his face a mask of practiced, jovial concern. Marlene felt the weight of the note she had prepared, a desperate plea for help, tucked into her sleeve. She began to move her hand, her movements jerky and slow, hoping to brush his arm and pass the paper. But Thomas was a predator. He sensed the shift in her energy. He caught her hand mid-air, weaving his fingers through hers in a display of performative affection. He squeezed her knuckles until she heard the joints pop, a silent command to stay still. Roberts laughed, charmed by the devotion of the local power couple. Marlene felt the crumpled scrap of paper slip from her numb fingers, disappearing back into the folds of her dress, unheard and unseen. Thomas led her into the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain, away from the prying eyes of the guests. His voice dropped to a whisper that was colder than the rain outside. He promised her that if she made one more move, if she so much as blinked out of turn, her dessert would be served in a locked ward at the state asylum. He reached out and smoothed a stray hair from her forehead, a gesture so chillingly intimate it made her skin crawl. Marlene looked into his eyes, vast, empty pits of blue, and knew he wasn't making a threat. He was stating a fact. The ultimatum hung over her like a guillotine blade, the rope fraying with every second that passed. She caught the eye of Mrs. Clark, who was standing by the fireplace adjusting her pearls. Marlene tried to lean forward, her mouth shaping the word help without sound. But Thomas's reaction was instantaneous. He dug his thumb into the soft underside of her elbow, his nail piercing the silk and sinking into the flesh. An electric jolt of pain shot up her arm, forcing her eyes shut. Mrs. Clark gave a thin, polite smile and turned back to her conversation about the church bake sale. Marlene stood frozen, feeling the warm, sticky trail of blood beginning to move down her arm under the sleeve. A secret agony hidden beneath the perfect blue silk. Thomas clapped his hands, a sharp, authoritative sound that cut through the chatter, and announced that dinner was served. He steered Marlene into the dining room, his hand a heavy weight on her shoulder. He seated her at the head of the long oak table, directly beneath the center of the heavy crystal lustra. She was trapped in a crossfire of gazes. The sheriff, the pastor, their wives, all of them watching her with a mix of curiosity and pity. Thomas took his seat at the far end, his eyes never leaving her face. The silver cutlery glinted under the lights, reflecting her own pale, haunted expression. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, the town's eyes waiting for the nervous Mrs. Baxter to finally snap. Marlene let her hand slide into the hidden pocket of her skirt, her fingers brushing the sharp, tattered edges of Elizabeth's letters. The rough texture of the paper seemed to cut through the fog of the drugs, a sudden, jagged spark of clarity in the darkness. She looked across the table at Thomas, who was raising his glass for a toast, his face glowing with the pride of a man who owned everything he saw. She realized then that this was the end of the road. She could either go quietly into the night he had built for her, or she could burn the house down. Thomas stood slowly, his movements fluid and arrogant, and raised his crystal glass. The wine inside looked like liquid gold under the chandelier. The room went silent, the guests leaning in to hear the words of the town's most successful man. Marlene didn't wait for him to speak. She slammed her palms onto the table, the force of the movement rattling the china. She shoved her chair back with a violent, screeching grind of wood on parquet. The heavy chair toppled over, hitting the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The conversation died instantly. Thomas froze, his glass halfway to his lips, a drop of wine spilling over the rim and onto his knuckles. Marlene stood tall, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and her voice, raw, cracked and powerful, tore through the suffocating silence of the room. Thomas's jaw dropped, his perfect mask finally fracturing. She plunged her hand into the blue silk and ripped out the stack of yellowed envelopes. The paper shrieked as she tore it free, the sound echoing in the stunned room. Marlene began to read, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every line of Elizabeth's agony. She read about the swapped pills, the locked doors, and the systematic destruction of a woman's soul. She thrust the letters toward the guests, showing them the cold, clinical charts of madness Thomas had drawn in his own hand. The air in the dining room grew thick with the stench of exposed secrets. Marlene's voice didn't falter as she laid bare the anatomy of a murder, turning the banquet into a courtroom. Thomas lunged across the table, his face a mask of feral rage. He swiped a plate of roast beef aside, sending gravy splattering across the white linen like a bloodstain. His fingers clawed toward her throat, but Marlene was faster, fueled by a sudden, jagged adrenaline. She dodged his reach, rounding the high-backed chairs of the guests. She threw herself toward Sheriff Roberts, who was just beginning to process the horror unfolding before him. She shoved the letters and the notebook into his hands, pressing the evidence against the brass buttons of his uniform. Roberts looked down at Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, his eyes widening as the truth sank in. Marlene ducked behind the sheriff's broad shoulders, her heart a frantic drum, but her mind as cold as the winter wind. Thomas let out a sound that wasn't human, a guttural, animal roar that shook the glasses on the table. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. He kicked a heavy oak chair out of his way, the wood splintering against the wall, and tackled Marlene before the sheriff could react. They hit the floor hard, Marlene's head snapping back against the parquet with a sickening thud. Thomas was on top of her in an instant, his thumbs buried in her windpipe. The world began to go black, red spots dancing in her vision as the oxygen was cut off. She saw only his eyes, vast, dark voids of pure, unadulterated hate. He wasn't a businessman or a husband anymore. He was the monster Elizabeth had described. finally unmasked in the light. Sheriff Roberts reacted with the speed of a man who had seen enough. He wrapped a thick arm around Thomas's throat, pulling him back with a grunt of exertion. Pastor Hill lunged forward, grabbing Thomas's arm and pinning it to the floor. Thomas thrashed like a landed shark, his boots scuffing the expensive wood as he spat curses and foam. The wives of the town's elite huddled in the corners, their screams echoing off the high ceilings. Thomas's expensive suit jacket tore at the shoulder, revealing the straining, angry muscles beneath. Marlene lay on the floor, gasping for air, watching as the man who had controlled her world was pinned to his own dinner table, his face pressed into a puddle of spilled wine. Marlene pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her eyes darting toward the open doors of the terrace. The guests were paralyzed, their attention locked on the violent struggle in the center of the room. She kicked off her high heels, the silk stockings sliding against the cold floor. On legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, she sprinted across the dining room, a blue ghost slipping past the frozen Mrs. Hill. She threw open the glass doors, and the night air hit her like a blessing, cold, wet, and smelling of the coming storm. She leaped from the stone steps onto the rain-soaked grass, never looking back at the house, never listening to the fading roars of the man she had finally broken. She ran down the gravel driveway, the sharp stones cutting into her bare feet. But she didn't feel the pain. At the iron gates, a security guard stepped into her path, his heavy flashlight beam blinding her. Marlene didn't slow down. She ran straight into the light, showing him the ruined silk of her dress, the purple bruises blooming on her neck, and the blood on her arms. The guard looked at her shattered face, then toward the house, where Thomas's animal howls were still audible through the rain. He saw the truth in the wreckage of her appearance. He slowly lowered the light and stepped back, his hand moving to the gate control. Marlene slipped through the opening and vanished into the darkness of the Wisconsin woods. The glare of headlights cut through the mist, illuminating Marlene's tattered silhouette on the shoulder of the highway. A rusted Ford truck slowed to a crawl, and she climbed into the cab, the air inside thick with the smell of diesel and old coffee. At the bus station, her fingers shook as she unlaced the bodice of her dress, reaching for a hidden seam. She pulled out a gold ring set with a heavy emerald, her mother's only legacy. The clerk behind the glass looked at the barefoot, bruised woman in the ruined evening gown with a mix of suspicion and fear. But he took the ring. He slid a one-way ticket to Madison across the counter. Marlene pressed her forehead to the cold window of the bus, feeling the engine hum beneath her. As the bus pulled away, the lights of Oak Creek faded into the fog, and the name Baxter became nothing more than a ghost. Marlene stepped out onto the porch of a roadside diner, the morning air crisp and smelling of pine and griddle grease. She was wearing a simple cotton uniform, a far cry from the silk shrouds Thomas had bought her. She tore open a thick paper envelope, her fingers, now calloused and stained with work, counting out a small stack of $20 bills. It was 30 days' worth of scrubbing pots and clearing tables, a meager sum by Thomas's standards. But to her, it was a fortune. She felt the weight of the money as a solid, undeniable foundation. She looked at her hands, seeing the fresh blisters and the broken nails, and she smiled. This money was hers. It didn't come with strings, and it didn't come with a manual on how to lose her mind. She climbed the narrow, creaking stairs of a boarding house, where the air smelled of floor wax and fried onions. In her rented room, a single bulb hummed under the ceiling, casting a harsh light on the bare walls and the iron bedstead. On the small wooden table, next to a chipped mug of tea, lay an official envelope with a blue court seal. Marlene traced the lines of the document, seeing her name listed next to Thomas's in the criminal filings. The letters she had saved and the testimony she had given had become a cage for the man who once built one for her. She sat down on the hard chair, the weight of the past finally lifting, replaced by the quiet, steady pulse of a life she had reclaimed. She picked up a pair of heavy tailor's shears, the blades glinting in the dim light. She grabbed a thick handful of the long, chestnut hair that Thomas had always insisted she keep perfectly coiffed. With a sharp, decisive snip, the first lock fell to the linoleum. She worked quickly, her movements sure, until the floor was littered with the remnants of the woman he had tried to create. She looked into the cracked mirror above the sink, seeing a stranger with a jagged, short crop and eyes that were no longer afraid. The doll in the silk dress was dead. Marlene brushed the stray hairs from her shoulders, feeling the cool air on the back of her neck. A sensation of lightness she hadn't known in a decade. She pulled her chair to the window, looking out at the quiet Madison Street below. The streetlights cast long, peaceful shadows, and the only sound was the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the dry grass. Marlene closed her eyes and took a breath. A deep, unobstructed breath that filled her lungs to the very bottom. There was no corset to stop it, no hand to choke it, and no fear to poison it. She was Marlene Wilson again, and for the first time in her life, the silence was beautiful.